Now before I get started, a short reminder, you have only one day left to get your new cat person t-shirt. So since we got that out of the way, I previously mentioned that the German army was quite self-critical about its performance during the invasion of Poland in 1939. And recently I stumbled across an interesting document from the General of the Infantry in the General Staff of the German Army from March 1932 with the title Hinweise für die Ausbildung der Infanterie auf Grund der Erfahrungen des Ostfeldzuges, which means notes for the infantry training based on the experiences of the Eastern Campaign. I selected a few parts and translated them and added some additional context to you. It starts with the general points. It is noted that the fighting principles, the Kampfgrundsätze, have been successful so far. This is followed up by the interpretation of the German army on the Eastern Front and the Soviets. To quote, "The characteristic of the Russian combat space are its vastness, its lack of roads and its lack of clarity. The Russian, a natural man of great hardness, deceitful and cruel, attacks in all situations and seeks close combat." I don't think anyone is particularly surprised by the negative statement about the Soviet soldiers here, considering the racism of the time and particularly in the German army. Yet I sometimes read rather unnuanced statements that the Germans completely disregarded the Soviets, which is quite oversimplified and, if you look at the positive mention above, also wrong. The Germans mostly disregard the leadership within the Red Army, yet had a quite high respect of the tenacity of the common soldier. This is also reflected by a statement from the Panzer Group 3 about the Battle of Minsk that occurred in the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa. Rutherford and Wettstein printed parts of it in their book, to quote, "Where the enemy chooses, he fights tenaciously and courageously until death. Deserters and surrender has been reported by no command. The struggle became therefore harder than in the Polish and the Western campaigns." Let's move on to the part about reconnaissance. Here the document actually refers to a Soviet statement about the German reconnaissance. A Russian statement about German reconnaissance says, "The German reconnaissance disguises itself badly and moves too conspicuously. Our observers can follow it closely. The reconnaissance always steps out of the positions on one and the same path, instead of deceiving us by changing the path." Now it's generally noted by many authors and also by German reports that the Soviets are masters in camouflage. As such, it's quite not surprising that the Soviets considered the Germans a bit clumsy in that regard. Yet what I found very interesting is that the Germans put in a special focus for the recon units to have proper firepower. The following points must be given special attention during training: monitoring by heavy weapons, advancing by bounds from observation point to observation point, observation and cover fire by the reconnaissance troop itself, cunning and deception, bringing along observers of heavy weapons or artillery with radio equipment. And speaking of firepower, the next section is about the firefight, Feuerkampf. The first paragraph notes that both in the offense and defense it is crucial that the direct and indirect fire is combined, something also explicitly noted in the artillery instructions as discussed in this video. Speaking of artillery, the document notes, "The Russian is very sensitive to the fire of our mortars, infantry guns and artillery. By combining the fire of all available weapons locally and temporarily, fire focus, the greatest possible effect can be achieved most quickly. Here lies the superiority of the German warfare against our opponents." Now be aware here that in the past the capitalist German I was often written as a capitalized J, as here with the infantry gun. From what I know, this was done to prevent confusion with the lowercase l. Yet back to the combining direct and indirect fire. In order to combine those in the best way, it is noted, for this purpose the heavy weapons must be as close as possible to rifle companies, depending on their location and terrain, and in close contact with them and with each other. Now this also underlines what many authors say about the Germans, that they focus extremely on combined arms warfare even before the Second World War. Now, if you want to see a general pre-war infantry company defensive setup, be sure to check out this video. It also comes with an example for defending a small village with a depleted unit as well. Let's move on. There's also a short part about the use of snipers. Equipping the best riflemen in a squad with rifle scopes and semi-automatic rifles allows them to be used as snipers. The use of snipers to shoot enemy leaders, observers and MG gunners up to medium range is always successful. Interesting here is the note of semi-automatic rifles, since those were not so common in early 1942, at least those from German production, but the numbers are generally a bit sketchy as this source notes. According to documents issued by the Army's Weapons Office of November 1941, a total of 5,800 such semi-automatic rifles were issued by the end of October of that year, of which about 3,800 were sent to the front. Yet the Germans also captured a lot of weapons in 1941 from the Red Army, and the Red Army had far more semi-automatic rifles, namely the SVT-40, of which about 1 million were produced in 1941, although it should be noted that the SVT-40 had some issues with accuracy. As already mentioned, the situation on the Eastern Front was noticeably different for the Germans. This is also pointed out again for the use or better management of ammunition. Ammunition consumption increased during the Eastern Campaign. For this reason, forward-thinking ammunition tactics are necessary, especially in defensive battles where the Russians often attack several times a day in waves. Let's move on to the attack. It is noted that the success of the German infantry in the attack is based upon a constant change in the method of attack and point in time. For instance, attack not always at the same time of day, but like the Russian, often at night, at dawn, during fog, or in a snowstorm. Furthermore, to use terrain, use focus fire of heavy weapons, assigning heavy weapons to the units that perform the assault, and to keep reserves to exploit any weaknesses in the enemy line. This is followed up with the following sentence. It must be the aspiration of every leader, therefore, to combine all forces, shock, fire and reserves, in the decisive position. Now here we need to make a short explanation about German concepts, namely the difference between Feuerkraft, firepower, and Stoßkraft, shock power. To quote the master thesis of the director of the Panzermuseum Munster, firepower was the term used to describe the effect of the firearms, like the wounding and killing of enemy soldiers, but also the effect of forcing them into cover, fire superiority. Shock power, on the other hand, meant the dash of the attack, which was presented by the momentum of the soldier in the assault, and which in the end was supposed to throw the opponents out of the position to be conquered. So the unit that performed the assault was delivering the shock power, and it was supported by heavy weapons, thus providing the additional firepower that should kill or at least suppress the enemy to allow the attackers to push forward. If the enemy is more powerful, the rifle company will use the effect of the heavy weapons to prepare for bounce of the squads and wait, dug in or in cover, for the next fire concentration on the newly emerged targets, in order to advance again individually or in squads. Squads and platoons shall keep close to the fire of indirect fire weapons and artillery. The aim of the final assault was to achieve a break-in in the enemy line, which is basically the precursor to the penetration. So basically a break-in is a hole in the front that has not been exploited yet, whereas the penetration is a hole in the front that also envelopes the enemy front line at the penetration points. Of particular interest is this part. The Russian is particularly sensitive to the combined break-in of the squad and platoon with Hooray and fires from the movement with light machine guns, submachine guns and semi-automatic rifles. Horn players blow the signal quickly forward. First, although we all associate the famous hurrah with stalwart infantry, it was actually both armies that used that phrase during a charge. Second, as already pointed out in my video on hip firing the MG34, this was a regular technique that was described and depicted in German Army's infantry training regulations. After the successful break-in, the commanders are instructed to keep the units together. This is similar to the regular infantry regulation that notes, the moment of weakness after the break-in requires special caution and energy from the squad leader. The first thing to do is to assert what has been won. The squad that got mixed up during the break-in has to be immediately pulled apart and restructured by the squad leader. Yet the document adds more here. It instructs to use special squads to make sure the position is properly secured, since experience had shown that Soviet soldiers sometimes play dead or hide themselves to then attack from behind later. Now let's talk a bit about defense. The first paragraph notes the following. The Russians always begins a systematic combat reconnaissance against the whole front. This combat reconnaissance is carried out in the form of reconnaissance attacks, which mostly take place in company strength, yet even in battalion strength. As a rule, he succeeds in finding weak spots with this approach. In any case, he is pushing ahead with the reconnaissance without any consideration for any losses that may arise. After this, the actual attack and breakthrough forces, like strongly massed infantry with tanks, are provided on the basis of the reconnaissance results. Reinforced mortar fire and tank fire at long distances often initiate the attack. If the foremost tanks are destroyed and the first attack is defeated, there is a pause of several hours. Then usually another attack takes place. Note that this is for 1941 and early 1942, especially in late war Soviet tactics and operations became more sophisticated, as discussed in my video on the Red Army myths. The notes instructs to constant observation and reconnaissance in combination to create a fire plan with the artillery. It is important that all weapons are able to swiftly conduct fire on their assigned areas. It is also noted that the combined surprise fire of heavy mortars, infantry guns, anti-tank guns and artillery against enemy assemblies and attacks could often smash them. Now, another aspect of the Eastern Front in defense was of course the long front lines. Defense in great widths is the rule in the East. It forces to occupy only the most important terrain points, like heights, bridges, forts, villages, roads and path forks, protruding forest edges, etc. These are to be developed like outposts and to be occupied depending upon importance with one or more squads, with assigned heavy weapons like heavy mortars, heavy machine guns and also anti-tank guns. An all-around defense must always be set up, since the Russians always tries to push through the gaps at night and in the fog. The outposts must be able to support themselves by flanking fire. If the outposts are far away from each other, the gaps must be occupied by a weak team in addition to strong scouting activities. And of course, outpost crews have to hold to the last man, otherwise the system of defenses collapses. They shall be provided with plenty of ammunition and food. It is also noted that the areas between these outposts should be covered with obstacles and mines in order to prevent the enemy to advance between them. Now if we consider a wide front line that is just dotted with a few outposts, there's one major problem: it lacks depth. As such, the notes point out that in order to create some depth within the line, reserves must be kept behind the main line of resistance. Particularly, it is noted, a fast, powerful, hasty counterattack always succeeds against the Russian. Now it is important here to note that the Germans made a clear distinction between a hasty counterattack, a Gegenstoß, literally counter push or blow, and a deliberate planned counterattack, a Gegenangriff, as pointed out by Kondel and Sabecki. But let's move on. One part is about how the soldiers should conduct themselves within the outposts. Since the Russians and his observers are watching the ground closely, the position must be dead. He very quickly recognizes weak spots and gaps and then attacks here. Furthermore, it is also noted that the listening post at night should have 2 men, since the Soviet soldier is very good at sneaking silently. The report notes katzenartig, which means cat-like. As such, besides the initial statement in the general points, the notes contain many positive remarks about the capabilities of the Red Army and particularly the Soviet soldier. Well, not much to add here. I hope you learned something new. Thanks to Philip for answering my questions about small arms. Special thanks to Jack for sending me books that helped making this video. Also a big thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. As always, sources are linked in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and see you next time.